The explosion took out 3 decks before I finished reading the casualty report from the last one. 43 million of my people were dead. Our 6th fleet was dust around the moons of Thesson Prime. The Vorathi hegemony had been cutting through Keth space like a blade through silk, and the Sovereign Chorus, the governing body I had served my entire adult life, had run out of ships, out of options, and out of time. They called me into the chamber at dawn. My mother, the Sovereign herself, looked older than I had ever seen her. She told me the Human Confederation had agreed to intervene. She told me the price. One of their officers. One of our daughters. A political marriage, sealed before their fleet would move. I said nothing. She had not asked for my opinion. She had asked for my presence at a ceremony the following morning. His name was Owen Calloway. He was 38 years old, a decorated commander from the Human Confederation's Outer Defense Division, with a service record that read like a list of things that should have killed him, and somehow had not. He walked into the ceremony hall without any of the nervousness I had expected. He held my hands with the right amount of firmness. He said the words in passable Keth, which surprised me, not because the pronunciation was perfect, it was not, but because the tonal markers were correct. That meant he had studied phonetics specifically, not just a translation program. He had actually studied. I noted this, the way you note a detail that might matter later. He did not try to speak to me afterward. He walked 2 paces behind me through the reception corridor, and when I looked back once, he was watching the exits. Not me, not the ceremony guests, the exits. I thought, this one is careful. I filed it away and went to negotiate the terms of the alliance with his superiors, who were considerably less impressive than he appeared to be. The Vorathi had started this war as a warm-up exercise. We learned this 3 months into the alliance, when human intelligence quietly shared what they had been watching for 10 years. The Vorathi hegemony had 17 species under their control. They had a fleet so precise and lethal that the standard response upon encountering one of their battle groups was to start calculating retreat routes immediately. Their command structure had no single point of failure, no weakness at the top, no one whose removal would bring anything down. They had been bleeding Keth space for 40 years because they wanted our trade corridors, and the war I had ended by marrying Owen was only the opening move. The real campaign was coming. 600 warships. A ground operation that would reduce Keth colony worlds to supply depots for Vorathi expansion. My mother sent a formal request for military support to the Human Confederation. She expected a fleet. She expected carrier groups, reinforced divisions, the kind of overwhelming force that makes an enemy reconsider their life choices at a strategic level. The Confederation sent Owen. I stood in the briefing room of my flagship as the full scope of the Vorathi threat was displayed across the holographic projector. 17 worlds, 400 warships already positioned, a logistics network so efficient it functioned like a living thing, and I looked at my husband standing to my left, hands clasped behind his back, and I thought, they sent one man to solve this. One man. He was not looking at the warships on the display. His eyes were moving in a very specific pattern, not the wide sweep of someone overwhelmed by information, but the tight, deliberate tracking of someone pulling one specific thread out of a very large tangle. He said, quietly, "Who authorized the logistics contracts in the Talvin corridor?" No one answered right away. The room had been thinking about 400 warships. "Because," he continued, "that is where I would start." He left 11 days later in a single shuttle, civilian class, unregistered, the kind of vessel that passes through contested space without generating alerts. He told me he was going to take a look at something. I had already learned that this was his way of saying he had decided what he was going to do and was being polite about not asking permission. I did not sleep well for 11 days. On the 12th day, the Vorathi hegemony's primary logistics contractor in the Talvin corridor collapsed. The public announcement cited regulatory violations, improper currency exchanges, and a series of contract irregularities that had apparently gone unnoticed for years until, suddenly, 3 separate hegemony oversight bodies, 2 independent trade tribunals, and a Vorathi Financial Review Council all noticed them at the same time, and all received the same anonymous documentation with striking detail. That contractor supplied 63% of the Vorathi forward fleet. By the time Owen returned, slightly thinner, with a new cut above his right eyebrow that he had dressed himself using a bandage from his jacket, 2 of the 6 Vorathi battle groups had been recalled due to supply shortfalls. 3 client species had filed formal economic complaints. 1 had declared administrative independence. He sat across from me at the briefing table and drank an entire pot of the caffeinated drink he preferred, and said nothing for a long time. I said, "You collapsed their supply chain." "I accelerated a collapse that was already there." "How long had you been watching it?" "Long enough." "That is not an answer." He looked at me then. 7 years, he said. "We have been watching Vorathi supply chain vulnerabilities for 7 years. I needed to be in position to use what we already had." I took a moment with that. "Your people have been preparing for a conflict with the Vorathi for 7 years. My people have been preparing for a conflict with anyone who might become a threat for about as long as we have been in space." He did not say it proudly. He said it the way he said everything consequential, like he was describing the weather, like it was simply a fact of the world that needed no further comment. That was when I stopped seeing Owen Calloway as a political arrangement. That was when I started seeing him for what he actually was. The Keth have a word, and there is no direct translation in any human language, but the closest approximation is this: the stillness of a predator that has already decided. You see it in the great hunting creatures of our homeworld. A complete absence of visible tension, because the outcome has already been calculated and found acceptable. They are not calm, they are done. They are simply waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up. Owen had this. He carried it like he carried his bandages, practically, without display, as though it were simply a useful thing to have on hand. The Vorathi did not wait long to respond. Fleet Prime Aura Vas Vorathi arrived at our border with 2 weakened battle groups and a diplomatic vessel flying the hegemony flag, which was either an offer to negotiate or an attempt at intimidation, dressed up as an offer to negotiate. Likely both. The Vorathi do not choose between their options when they can pursue all of them simultaneously. The transmission came addressed to me. It said the Sovereign Chorus had been manipulated by the Human Confederation into hosting hostile intelligence operations against the hegemony. It said I could submit a formal apology and expel the human diplomatic mission from Keth space in exchange for Vorathi restraint. It did not mention Owen by name. It did not need to. I brought the message to Owen. He read it. He read it again. Then he asked if he could respond. I said, "Technically, it is addressed to me." "Right," he said, "but I would like to respond to it." I looked at him for a moment. My husband. This human, with his 7 years of prepared documentation, and his civilian shuttle, and his bandages from his jacket pocket, wanting to personally respond to a Vorathi fleet prime who commanded more firepower than everything I had left in my defensive grid. I said, "What would you say?" He told me. I listened without interrupting for 4 minutes, which is not something I do often. Then I said, "You cannot mean to do all of that." "I do not mean to," he said. "I have already done most of it. This is the part where I explain it." The file he transmitted to Fleet Prime Aura was 43 hours of reading. It contained the complete communication records of every Vorathi client species administrator who had been pressured or bribed into cooperation with the hegemony over the past 2 decades. It contained the identities of 9 Vorathi intelligence operatives embedded in Keth administrative structures, operatives the Vorathi did not know we had identified. It contained a detailed financial record of Fleet Prime Aura's personal accounts on 3 different financial networks, including 2 accounts held under a name that did not match the Fleet Prime's legal designation. And it contained, buried near the end of the file, in clean and unremarkable formatting, the full text of a private treaty the Vorathi hegemony had negotiated with the Tesserine Collective, a treaty that promised the Tesserine full access to Keth trade routes once Keth space had been absorbed into the hegemony, a treaty the Tesserine Collective had believed to be completely secret. It was no longer secret. Owen had sent it simultaneously to every recognized government within 6 relay stations, with a covering summary in 7 languages, including Tesserine Standard. The Tesserine Collective had been the Vorathi's most loyal client state for 80 years. Had been. Fleet Prime Aura did not respond to our transmission. The diplomatic vessel departed our border within 48 hours. The 2 battle groups followed within 72. A week later, the first formal proceedings against 3 members of the Vorathi High Council were filed by their own internal oversight structures, on the basis of evidence delivered anonymously to sources that could not be traced back to any identifiable origin. I stood at the observation window of my flagship and watched the Vorathi forces withdraw on the long-range display, one by one. Called home to manage a political disaster of their own making, dismantled by a man who had spent 7 years cataloging their weaknesses and 11 days in a civilian shuttle, making those weaknesses impossible to ignore. I said, "You have destroyed them." He said, "I have destabilized them. Full collapse will take roughly 10 years, assuming no one intervenes to hold them together. No one will. Their client states are about to have a very informative few months. You did this alone." He was quiet for a moment. "I did the last part alone. A great many people spent years building toward it. But you were the one who used it." He did not answer. He was watching the display, watching the Vorathi ships disappear from the grid with the same expression he always had when he watched exits. Steady, measuring, not satisfied exactly, more like confirmed. There is a difference, I have learned, between humans who fight and humans who have already won. Owen was not fighting. He had won this particular engagement somewhere around year 3 of a 7-year preparation, and the 11 days in the shuttle were simply the final administrative step. The Vorathi had sent their fleet against the border without knowing they were already losing. They had been losing since before the war with the Keth even began. The weeks that followed were strange. News of the Tesserine betrayal spread through the hegemony's client states, faster than their diplomatic corps could contain it. 2 more species filed for administrative independence. A third stopped paying the resource tributes that had funded the Vorathi military for decades. The hegemony's internal political structure, which had looked impenetrable from the outside, turned out to be riddled with the kind of resentment that builds over generations of enforced obedience and requires only one match to become something irreversible. Owen had not thrown the match. He had spent 7 years arranging the materials around it. I asked him once, during this period, how he had learned to think this way. We were in the small common room off the briefing deck, late in the night cycle, and he was reviewing something on a handheld display while I read a report on the diplomatic fallout from the Tesserine revelation. He looked up at the question. He thought about it for a moment, which was not something he always did. Usually he answered immediately. When he paused, it meant he was deciding how much of a real answer to give. He said, "I grew up in a city that flooded 3 times before I was 12. Every few years, you would watch people lose everything, because the water came in overnight. My father spent his career trying to convince the municipal government to build better drainage. They never did, while he was alive. By the time they finally did it, a lot of people had lost a lot of things that they did not need to lose." He went back to his display. After a moment, he said, "I decided when I was pretty young that if I could see something coming, I was going to be ready for it before it arrived. It seemed like the obvious approach." He said this without any particular emotion. No bitterness about his father. No pride about himself. Just a straightforward description of a conclusion he had reached as a child and had never seen any reason to revise. Humans are confusing in many ways. Their biology is remarkable in its fragility. They bleed at the slightest provocation. Their bones fracture. They require sleep at intervals that would be operationally crippling for most spacefaring species. They need to eat several times a day, or they become irritable in ways that are disproportionate to the actual threat level. By every biological measure, they are not built for the kind of universe we all live in. And yet, they carry bandages, they build drainage systems, or they spend careers trying to convince others to build drainage systems, or they grow up watching the consequences of not building drainage systems and resolve to be the kind of person who builds them early, when it still matters. They are a species that learned, somewhere in their long and difficult past, that the universe does not wait for you to be ready, and that the only meaningful response to this information is to always, always be ready anyway. I have met many human officers since Owen. I have met commanders and diplomats and intelligence officers and engineers. I have met humans who appeared reckless, who seemed impulsive, who by outward appearance had no particular plan at all. But if you watch them long enough, and I have learned to watch carefully, every one of them is carrying something, a contingency, a prepared answer, a file that has been quietly building for 7 years, in case it is ever needed. It is not strategy exactly. It is older than strategy. It is what strategy becomes when a species has practiced it for so long that it stops being a decision and starts being a way of moving through the world. My mother called the marriage the smartest thing the sovereign chorus had ever agreed to. She was right, though not entirely for the reasons she thought. It did not simply buy us a military alliance. It bought us access to the way humans approach a problem, which is to say, they approach every problem as though they have been expecting it for years, because very often they have. The Vorathi hegemony did not fall in a battle. There was no decisive engagement, no single moment where warships met and one side broke. It fell because one human spent 7 years watching it from a distance and identifying every place where it was pretending to be stronger than it was, and then spent 11 days making sure those pretensions were no longer private knowledge. It fell the way things fall when they have been quietly hollow for a long time, and someone finally applies pressure to exactly the right place. Other governments noticed. Of course they did. In the months after the Tesserine revelation, 3 different civilizations sent formal inquiries to the Human Confederation, requesting diplomatic consultation. 2 of them were species that had previously declined to engage with humanity on the grounds that humans were too new, too small, too recently arrived in the wider community of spacefaring civilizations to warrant serious attention. They were more attentive now. Owen sat through the diplomatic meetings that followed with his usual expression. Present. Focused. Watching the room the way he watched exits. Not proud, not interested in credit. When the Confederation's senior diplomat, a woman named Laura Denning, arrived to manage the formal negotiations, Owen briefed her for 4 hours, and then stepped back and let her lead. He did not need to be seen. He had never needed to be seen. Laura told me privately, one afternoon, that Owen had been the one to first flag the Vorathi situation 6 years ago, when it was still a theoretical concern, and no one wanted to allocate resources to it. She said he had written the same memo 4 separate times to 4 different oversight committees before anyone took it seriously. She said he had kept building the file anyway, because he believed it would matter eventually, and because not building it was not something he was capable of. She said this with a kind of fondness that told me he was well regarded by people who knew what to look for, and quietly underestimated by people who needed something loud and visible to respect. I have thought about that a great deal. 9 years into my role as High Emissary to the Human Confederation, people still ask me what they are like. Scholars, diplomats, military analysts from a dozen different civilizations, who want to understand how a species 3 centuries into spaceflight became the single most consequential force in known galactic politics. They expect a complicated answer. They expect something about military doctrine, or technological development, or some unique biological advantage. I tell them about the bandages. I tell them that Owen cut his hand on a sensor panel during our 3rd week aboard my flagship. A small thing. He produced a bandage from his jacket, covered it, and continued working. When I asked why he carried bandages, he said, "Because he bleeds sometimes." When I pointed out that carrying the solution to your own vulnerability was interesting, he said, calling it a vulnerability, assumed he was not already dealing with it. This, I tell them, is what humans are. They are not superior to us physically. They are not faster, not more resilient, not built for the cosmos any more than any other creature that climbed out of a gravity well and decided to see what was up there. But they carry bandages. They carry contingencies. They build drainage systems, or they spend careers trying to, or they grow up watching what happens when no one does, and they resolve to be different. They are a species that never had the comfort of feeling safe, not for one generation in their entire history, and they carried that restlessness into space as their most fundamental piece of equipment. Some nights I find Owen still awake long after the ship has gone quiet, standing at the observation window, looking at the dark between stars, not anxious, not troubled, just watching, measuring, doing the thing humans do, which is to look at everything around them and ask what they should know about it that they do not know yet. I bring him his drink, and I sit beside him, and I do not ask what he is thinking. I have learned that I will find out, usually when whatever he is thinking about has already been resolved. He told me once, looking out at that dark, that there are approximately 400 known civilizations within communication range of Earth, and that human intelligence services have working files on the internal politics of about 350 of them. I asked how far back those files went. He said some of them went back before humanity had left the solar system. I looked at him for a long time after that. He glanced over. It seemed like the obvious approach, he said. And then he went back to watching the dark, the way he always does, steady and patient, and already 3 steps ahead of whatever the dark was going to send our way next. I married him to end a war. I watched him end an empire from a civilian shuttle in 11 days. The war I understood. The empire took me longer. But I think I finally understand the man. He was never surprised by any of it. He never was.